The Galactic Council had seen it all. Comprised of beings from across the universe, some humanoid, others entirely alien in appearance, they had governed the galaxy for centuries. They had witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations, the formation of alliances, and the occasional war that would shake the very foundations of the galaxy. Yet despite all the noise, the politics, and the endless chatter of hundreds of different species, there had always been one constant: the humans. Humans, though relatively new to the galactic stage, had carved out their place with an undeniable raw energy. Their ships would send out constant transmissions, their planets would buzz with activity, and their fleets were always active, never idle. The humans had always been a noisy, busy species, fighting, arguing, trading, and sharing information. It was their nature. The Council had come to expect this. The humans, for all their flaws, were predictable. But now, there was silence. For days, there had been no transmission from human fleets, no reports of new missions, no status updates from their military commanders, and no diplomatic messages from their leaders. At first, it was brushed off as a technical glitch, but when days turned into weeks, the silence became too loud to ignore. The Council convened in their massive floating chamber, a vast space filled with high-tech consoles and floating screens. Each species had their own unique way of communicating, but today they all shared one common expression: confusion. They had always been able to predict human behavior, but now they found themselves at a loss. "Where are they?" one counselor asked, their voice a soft, melodic hum that filled the chamber. It came from an alien species with translucent skin that glowed faintly, giving them an ethereal presence. Another counselor, a towering figure made entirely of shifting, amorphous metallic liquid, responded in a deep, vibrating tone. "It's as if they vanished. No signals, no contact. Nothing." The silence stretched, thick and heavy, as the council members pondered the implications. No communication at all. That was far too strange. The human fleets, the human colonies, and their vast networks were always in motion. If they had gone silent, it could only mean one of two things. Either something had happened to them, or they had chosen to stop speaking entirely. "Do we send a message?" asked a small, insect-like counselor with multifaceted eyes, who fluttered anxiously in their seat. Their many legs twitched nervously as they scrolled through reports of the missing human fleets. "Yes," replied the council's leader, a being of immense size and intelligence, whose body was a swirling mass of light and energy. "We must make contact. We cannot afford to wait any longer. We need answers." But when the transmission was sent, there was no response. No return signal. It was as though the human fleets had simply turned off their communications entirely. The Council scrambled to send additional messages, trying different frequencies, trying to catch a signal in the chaos of the galaxy's vast communication channels. Nothing. As the silence stretched on, panic began to set in among the Council. For a race that had dealt with countless different species, from the peaceful to the warlike, they had never experienced a situation quite like this. The humans were unpredictable, yes, but they were always present. They always had something to say. But now, it was as if they had disappeared. "Perhaps they're hiding," suggested one of the counselors, a reptilian species with scales that shifted from green to blue. "Maybe they've gone into hiding, or worse, they're preparing for something big." "That doesn't explain the silence," countered another. "Even when they prepare for war, they'd broadcast their intentions. They never go silent." The council was growing desperate. Was this some sort of new weapon, a silent attack meant to leave their enemies blind? Was it some sort of virus that had shut down the human systems? Or was it something even worse, something that they hadn't yet even considered? The uncertainty was maddening. The council's leader, the mass of light and energy, floated motionlessly as they pondered the situation. "We cannot afford to underestimate the humans. They are resourceful and unpredictable. If they have found a way to stop communicating, then we must understand why." The days dragged on, each one feeling like an eternity. The silence remained, and with it, a gnawing fear that something far worse was looming on the horizon. The council was no longer sure if they were dealing with a strategic maneuver, an attack, or a catastrophe. But one thing was becoming painfully clear. The humans, the very species the council had always seen as loud and chaotic, had somehow found a way to make the entire galaxy listen to them in a way they never had before. As the silence grew, so did the fear. What did it mean when humans, the very heart of the galaxy's hustle and bustle, suddenly went completely quiet? The council was about to find out, but they feared it might already be too late to understand. The silence had now stretched far beyond anything the council had expected. Days turned into weeks, and the tension in the chamber grew heavier with each passing moment. The usual hum of activity that filled the council's meeting rooms was replaced by an eerie stillness, a feeling that made even the most seasoned members of the council uneasy. The air was thick with anxiety, uncertainty, and fear. Not one being in that room had ever experienced something so utterly foreign. The humans were gone, at least in every way the council understood. But the question remained, where had they gone, and why? At first, some council members held out hope. Maybe this was all part of a master plan, a tactic, a mere lull before the next human advance. They had used silence before in diplomatic negotiations, after all. But the more the silence lingered, the more fragile that hope became. The humans had always been loud, energetic, and unpredictable. They were a species of action, of noise, of constant motion. But now, they were nothing more than a distant memory. The council members exchanged uneasy glances. They had ruled the galaxy with precision, handling crises of every magnitude. But this was something they couldn't process. The humans had stopped all communication without warning, and there was no sign of them. No ships appeared on their sensors. No new colonies sent out reports. It was as if they had vanished completely. There must be something we are missing, one counselor, a being of crystalline form, said, their voice trembling with doubt. Perhaps we need to send a fleet to investigate. We cannot afford to remain idle any longer. The council's leader, the massive, ever-shifting entity of light, weighed the suggestion carefully. I agree. We need to take action. If they are hiding, we need to find them. If they have fallen silent for a reason we do not understand, we need to know what that reason is. We cannot sit here and do nothing. And so, the decision was made. A fleet of council ships would be dispatched to the last known coordinates of the human fleets. It was a risky move. No one knew what they would encounter. The silence had already proven to be unsettling, and the council members feared what they might uncover. The fleet launched in the dead of night, its sleek vessels cutting through the darkness of space with ease. The journey would take several days, but the tension within the fleet was palpable. The crews were ready for anything, or at least they thought they were. They had never prepared for a scenario like this. Upon arrival at the coordinates, they found nothing. No human ships, no stations, no communications, just a vast, empty void. One by one, the council ships scoured the area. They examined every corner of the galaxy sector, searching for any trace of the missing humans. But there was no sign, no debris, no wreckage, no signals. The area was completely barren, as if the humans had never been there at all. It didn't make sense. Report. The leader of the fleet, an imposing figure made of living shadows, called out to his crew. No sign of human activity, my lord. It's as if they've completely disappeared, came the reply, filled with both confusion and a growing sense of dread. The fleet leader hesitated, staring out into the cold expanse of space. This can't be possible. They couldn't have just vanished. There has to be something we're missing. As the fleet continued its search, the council members back in the meeting chamber were growing more desperate. The information coming in was grim. Still no communication, still no sign of human life. The silence was absolute. One of the more seasoned council members, a figure with dark, alien skin and glowing red eyes, spoke up. "I've seen war before. I've seen entire civilizations fall to weapons we couldn't even comprehend. But this is something new. This silence is like nothing I have ever encountered." Another counselor, an elegant bird-like species, nodded gravely. "Perhaps they've discovered something that we cannot understand. Some new form of communication, or worse, some new weapon. What if they've learned to block our signals, to shield themselves from us entirely?" The leader of the council, their body swirling with thoughts, paused. "If this is a weapon, we will find it. But we must prepare ourselves for the possibility that this is not an attack. What if the humans are trying to tell us something? Something we haven't yet considered?" The thought sent a shiver down the spines of many present. What could the humans possibly want to convey with silence? Silence wasn't a weapon. It wasn't a message. It was a void. A gap in communication, one that left the council unable to read the situation, unable to understand what was happening. The more they thought about it, the more they realized that the silence itself was a form of power. It was as if the humans were withholding something, perhaps their most dangerous secret yet. The council had dealt with countless species, had seen technology far more advanced than their own, but they had never faced a species that could simply vanish, leaving nothing behind. It was a terrifying thought. The silence stretched on. The council had no answers. They had no leads, and the longer it continued, the more uncertain the galaxy's future became. What could have caused this strange and unsettling quiet? And more importantly, how would they be able to stop it before it was too late? The council was teetering on the edge of panic. The silence had persisted for longer than any of them had ever imagined. Weeks had passed without a single human transmission, and despite their best efforts, they still hadn't discovered anything. Every attempt to uncover the truth only led to more questions, and the council was slowly starting to feel the pressure. Their once unshakable confidence had begun to crack, and now they were scrambling for answers, uncertain of how to proceed. Then, unexpectedly, the breakthrough came. A lone scout ship, a human vessel thought to be lost in the vast emptiness of space, appeared on the edge of the galaxy. It wasn't much to look at. Its design was simple, unadorned, and worn. It was a ship of little consequence in the grand scheme of things, not a military vessel or a powerful flagship, just a regular scout ship that had long since been thought abandoned. But when the council's sensors detected it, there was a sudden flicker of hope. This was a human ship, one that had somehow managed to survive in the silence that had plagued the galaxy for so long. But the question remained, why had it returned? The council immediately ordered a transmission to be sent to the ship, a desperate plea for answers. The silence, however, persisted. No response. The ship just drifted in the dark, isolated from the rest of the universe. Despite the silence, the council didn't give up. They dispatched a fleet of their own vessels to investigate the human ship, hoping that somehow they would be able to make contact in person. As the fleet approached, the tension in the council's chamber grew unbearable. This was their first real lead, and they couldn't afford to let it slip away. The fear was palpable. The humans had disappeared without a trace, and now one of their ships had reappeared. But there was no telling what they would find. It was a risk, but one they had to take. The fleet arrived at the coordinates, surrounding the silent human vessel. The ships hovered in the emptiness of space, their engines emitting faint hums, barely noticeable against the backdrop of the galaxy. The crew of the fleet stared at the human ship, waiting for a sign of life. Nothing. Hours passed. The council sent more transmissions, but still there was no response. The human ship remained unmoving, as if it were simply another piece of debris drifting in space. It was then that something strange happened. The human ship's lights flickered on, faintly illuminating the surrounding darkness. The council's fleet moved closer, sensors scanning the ship for signs of life. But still, there was nothing. No life signs, no crew aboard. And yet, the ship was somehow still operational. It was as if the vessel had been abandoned, but had managed to continue running on its own. A signal was finally sent, and it wasn't from the ship's communication systems. Instead, it came from somewhere within the Council's fleet itself. It was an unexpected burst of static, one that slowly gave way to something that felt more like a presence than a message. Then came the transmission. The words, when they finally came through, were simple, but they held an unimaginable weight. They weren't coming from the ship, nor were they being spoken by any being aboard it. The words felt different, distant, almost as though they were being sent from everywhere and nowhere all at once. They came to the Council not as sound, but as thought. "We have learned. We have found the way." The voice, or perhaps it was a thought, resonated within the minds of the counselors. There was no crackling distortion, no static, just a calm, clear message that seemed to echo through their very consciousness. For a moment, they all froze, unable to comprehend what they had just experienced. "What is this?" one of the council members demanded. "What does this mean?" The response came again, but this time it was more direct. "We do not speak the way you do. We do not use your words anymore." The council members stared at each other, confused. How could this be? What did the humans mean by this? Had they developed some new form of communication? Something that didn't rely on speech or signals? It didn't make sense. The message continued. "We are connected now. We no longer need the old ways. The silence. It is our strength. It is how we have learned to see." The words were cryptic, but they were clear enough. The humans had found something that allowed them to communicate without the need for language, without the need for sound. It was as if they had transcended traditional communication altogether. But how? And more importantly, what did this mean for the rest of the galaxy? One of the council members, a being made of crystalline light, spoke first. "Are you saying that you no longer need our methods of communication? That you can simply think together, share your thoughts without speaking?" The response came swiftly, as though the humans were answering not with words, but with a shared understanding. "Yes, we have found the way to connect, to understand each other without words." The council was stunned. This was something they had never seen before. The humans had unlocked a new form of communication, one that was beyond the comprehension of any species in the galaxy. It was not just a new way of speaking, it was a new way of thinking. The implications were vast, and the council had no idea how to handle it. But the more they thought about it, the more they realized that this silence, the one they had feared for so long, was not a void. It was a gateway. The humans had found a new way to communicate, a way that bypassed everything the council understood. And now, they were left with no choice but to try and understand it themselves. The fear that had gripped the council began to shift. It was no longer a fear of the unknown. It was a fear of what might come next. The humans had changed, evolved into something entirely different. The council had underestimated them. And now, they were facing a species that no longer needed to be controlled or understood. The silence that had terrified them was, in fact, a harbinger of something far greater. And they were about to find out just how powerful the humans had become. The council sat in stunned silence as the transmission ended, the weight of the message settling heavily over them. They had feared the human silence, but now they realized it was not a weapon, not an attack, but an evolution, one that had left the council in the dark. The humans had discovered something they could not even begin to comprehend, a new form of communication that defied everything they knew about language, thought, and interaction. The silence in the council chamber was deafening. No one spoke. No one moved. All the counselors, each one a powerful and ancient being in their own right, were struggling to grasp the enormity of what had just happened. The humans had transcended their old ways, and in doing so, had become something far more dangerous. They had gone beyond what the council had assumed was possible. One by one, the counselors looked at each other, each of them coming to the same unsettling realization. The humans were no longer just a chaotic, noisy species trying to fit in with the rest of the galaxy. They were now something entirely new, a species that could communicate on a level that bypassed every barrier the Council had put in place. The humans no longer needed words, signals, or even ships. They could simply think. The Council leader, the vast being made of swirling light and energy, finally spoke. We underestimated them. Their voice echoed throughout the chamber, a soft hum that resonated in the minds of all present. The humans have evolved beyond our understanding. We cannot approach them the way we have approached other species. Another council member, one with a form that flickered between solid and liquid, spoke up. But how do we engage with them now? How do we communicate when they no longer speak the same language? When they no longer need to speak at all? The leader hesitated, their shimmering body pulsing with thought. We must adapt. We must learn their new way of thinking. But we must also be careful. If they can communicate in ways we cannot understand, how can we be sure their silence is not a threat? What happens when a species that can think without speaking decides it no longer wants to share its thoughts with the galaxy? The fear returned, seeping into the Council's thoughts like a cold shadow. The implications of the humans' newfound power were terrifying. If they could now think as one, if they could share ideas and strategies without needing to speak or send messages, then what was stopping them from overpowering the rest of the galaxy? What if they decided to take control? As the Council deliberated, their thoughts were interrupted by another unexpected event. The human ship, still drifting silently in the darkness, emitted a new burst of energy. The Council's ships responded quickly, their systems scanning for any sign of activity. But there was nothing. It was as if the ship was just a beacon, a symbol of something much larger. Then, a new message came through. But it wasn't directed at the Council. It was a message to the galaxy at large. We are here. We are awake. And we will no longer be silent. The message sent a ripple of shock across the galaxy. It was not just a declaration from the humans. It was a challenge, a warning. The message was heard across countless planets, in countless languages, but the meaning was the same. The humans were no longer the underdogs, no longer the species struggling to fit in. They had found something greater than themselves, something that had shifted the balance of power in the galaxy. The galaxy, once so full of noise and clamor, was now eerily still. No one knew what to do. The humans had made it clear that they were not going to be quiet anymore. They had discovered something that could change everything, something that left the Council and the rest of the galaxy unsure of what was to come next. The Council gathered again, their once confident demeanor now replaced with uncertainty. They had always been in control, always been the ones who set the terms of engagement. But now, for the first time, they were facing a species that had bypassed all their systems, all their rules, and all their limitations. How do we respond to this? The crystalline counselor asked, their voice tinged with anxiety. How do we fight against a species that no longer needs to fight the way we do? We cannot fight them, the leader of the Council said quietly. We can only learn from them, but we must do so carefully. The humans have shown us that they are not the chaotic, unpredictable species we thought them to be. They have found something that we don't understand. As the Council members pondered the message, they realized that the human silence had not just been a retreat or a withdrawal. It had been a preparation. The humans had been evolving, and now they were ready to step into the future, into a new way of being. The galaxy was no longer what it had been. And the Council, despite their centuries of experience, was now faced with an entirely new challenge. The Council had been the ones who controlled the flow of information, who made the decisions that shaped the galaxy. But now, it seemed, they were no longer the most powerful force in the galaxy. The humans had unlocked something greater, something that could change everything. The question was no longer whether the Council could control the humans. The question was, could the galaxy survive the human silence, or would it be forever altered by what they had learned? As the Council members sat in contemplation, the galaxy waited, holding its breath, uncertain of what would come next. The galaxy was on the brink of transformation, teetering between fear and awe. The humans had broken the very fabric of communication, evolving into something incomprehensible, something beyond the grasp of the Council and every other species in the galaxy. The Council had once been the gatekeepers of power, the decision-makers, the ones who set the rules. But now, with the humans' new way of thinking, everything had changed. In the Council's chambers, the debate continued. The once mighty Council members were now deeply unsettled. They had spent eons studying the galaxy, understanding the weaknesses and strengths of every species, but the humans had thrown all of that knowledge into chaos. The silence they had feared was now understood to be a powerful tool, a means of connecting, of evolving, and of thinking as one. How do we stop them? One of the Council members, a being whose form shifted like shadows, asked, their voice thick with uncertainty. How do we stop a species that can think together without ever speaking? The leader of the Council, the entity made of pure light, finally spoke, their tone grave. We don't stop them. We can't. We need to understand them, or we risk being overtaken by them. The fleet leader, still trembling with fear, stood beside the Council, his form trembling as he addressed the leader. But they are not the same species anymore. They are something entirely new. They could conquer the galaxy if they wished. The leader paused, their luminous form pulsing with thought. That may be true, but they have not shown aggression. They have shown only a desire to exist, to learn. The silence they have embraced is not a weapon, but a shield. It is a form of protection, a way of making sure they are not misinterpreted, not misunderstood. If we try to fight them, we may push them into something we cannot contain. The words hung in the air, and the room grew heavy with the realization that the Council was powerless against the humans. There were no weapons, no tricks, no strategies that could break the bond the humans now shared. They were no longer isolated individuals. They were a collective consciousness, a singular mind spread across the entire species. The silence that had once terrified them now seemed to be the humans' greatest strength. The Council members began to understand that the silence wasn't just a retreat. It was a deliberate move, a decision to evolve beyond their previous limitations. We must offer them peace, the leader of the Council finally said. We must seek to understand them. If we approach them with hostility, we will lose everything. If we try to control them, we will fail. But if we offer them what they desire, understanding, respect, we may find a way to coexist. A murmur of agreement rippled through the Council, though many were still hesitant. The idea of coexisting with the humans, a species so unpredictable and so powerful, was a daunting thought. But it was the only option they had left. They had underestimated the humans, and now they had to reconcile with the reality that the galaxy was no longer in their hands. Meanwhile, on the edges of the galaxy, the humans, united in their newfound connection, were observing the Council's every move. The message they had sent to the galaxy was clear. They were awake, they were present, and they would no longer be silenced. But their message had not been one of aggression. They had not made demands, had not threatened the galaxy with destruction. They simply sought to make others understand that they had changed, that they had evolved into something new. And then, without warning, a final transmission came through. It was different this time. It was not directed at the Council, nor at any specific species. It was a message to the entire galaxy, broadcasted across every frequency, reaching every corner of space. We have learned. We have grown. We are now as one, and we will no longer hide. You do not need to fear us. We will not force you to change, but we will offer you a choice. Evolve with us, or remain as you are. The path we have found is open to all. Come, learn with us. It is the future of the galaxy. The transmission ended, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. The humans were offering peace, but more than that, they were offering a chance to join them, to evolve alongside them. The message was clear. The humans were no longer just a species. They were a movement a force that could shape the future of the entire galaxy. The Council, still reeling from the enormity of what they had learned, knew that they had reached a critical moment. The decision was theirs. The rest of the galaxy would soon have to decide whether to join the humans in their new way of thinking or risk being left behind, stranded in the past. The humans had gone quiet not to threaten, but to prepare. They had found a way to connect, to transcend, and now they were offering the galaxy the opportunity to follow. The choice was clear: adapt or be forgotten. As the council convened once more, the leader spoke the words that echoed through the minds of all present. This is not a war. It is a new beginning, and we must decide if we are ready to embrace it. The galaxy stood at the edge of an unknown future, one that was no longer in the hands of the old powers, but in the hands of a species that had risen from the silence. The humans had found their way. And now, it was time for the rest of the galaxy to decide whether they would walk with them into the new era.